what happened obviously in Panama in 1989. And even though that was 6 weeks, a 2-month campaign, it was still very messy and not a good look for H.W. Bush at the time. But from one analysis piece I read, it said that there was enough military buildup by the US now for sufficient, quote, seizure operation. Would you agree with that?
I don't think so. I think we're still a little bit light, but this is what's so frustrating, man, because if that's what we're trying to do, let's have that conversation, right? And are we on board with going into Venezuela with boots on the ground or not? I feel like we're not having that conversation, though, because everything is framed with stopping the flow of drugs into the United States. So it's just hitting cartel boats. But like you're saying, and I'm sure your audience has seen this steady escalation looks like more than stopping cartel boats.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to part 2. But yeah, no, we're in the midst of Russia, Ukraine, and the US, and I want to slowly pivot towards the US national security and touch upon Venezuela a little bit later on, Preston. But you made a good point, and also I'm glad that you were able to answer the last question at the end of the first half, because I sort of am sitting here thinking, oh God, did I just reveal sort of my rather primitive military knowledge? So I'm glad you somehow managed to concoct some kind of answer there. But I guess looking forward is what foreseeable scenario can you see for Ukraine, right? I personally think the war is going to be decided largely off the battlefield, primarily, I think, on the pressures on the Russian economy and Putin's internal situation. But it could still well be that, Russia is able to overwhelm the Europeans through, cyber warfare? Where do you think the biggest leverage Russia has at this moment?
The biggest leverage Russia has is they are more interested in Ukraine than most of Europe is, I would say, and the United States. So it's going to be easier to sell their population on continuing this war for a longer period of time than it's Russia against Ukraine, but Ukraine really does need a lot of Western support to be able to stay in the fight. And I think there's a greater chance of that Western support falling before Russian support does. Huge win for Russia if they end up going at Ukraine one-on-one. And I think that's probably their advantage, is just being able to stay in the fight for a while.
But do you not think that was part of the reason why Putin did it? I made a video about it, the real reason Putin provoked NATO, which is simply he's getting desperate. In my mind, you don't do that unless your back is somewhat against the wall, and he's trying to effectively distract NATO member states towards their own national security, domestic issues, than to continue supporting Ukraine. And that's why I was a little bit in the first half wondering, what was the point of this if he's not going to sustain it, keep doing it? You don't agree with that?
No, I think I do. I think I'm on the same page there, that part of the gamble necessarily was that there would not be this widespread support, at least for a long period of time. And I think Putin was partially correct in that we haven't seen direct Western forces arrive in theater. We've not seen offensive actions or really even defensive actions taken by NATO against Russia since this began. But I think I think we're saying the same thing, or maybe I misunderstood you.
No, I think you're better at just articulating and summarizing. No, we're saying the same thing. But on that point, you've made a lot of videos about the US interests in the war in Ukraine. And there was quite a pivotal, I think it was the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, which, basically alluded to the fact that Trump has been supplying this intelligence for deeper strikes into Russia. Why do you think, aside from Trump's bruised ego, do you think the US intelligence community is shifting towards more a hawkish stance on Russia again?
These are little steps that can be taken with not a lot of blowback on the United States, but a possible big impact on the battlefield. So what we're seeing right now, Ukraine is utilizing their own drones. According to the reporting, they are coming to the United States and saying, here's a target we want to hit. And then US intel uses our vast resources to say, here's a good route based off of X, Y, and Z, and here are the vulnerabilities of that location. Most of those strikes are against energy infrastructure, oil refineries, and the like. So we're seeing that day in and day out, and it looks like there's been a real assessment by the United States that Russia is at risk for any number of, the hits on these refineries is causing real damage and could push Putin to the negotiating table. U.S. providing that intelligence, the rational response is not for an attack against the United States. It's going to be a ways for Russia to ramp up there. It seems like it's a very low lift. It's intel we already have. It's benefiting the United States to continue gathering this intel inside of Russia. Ukraine is able to leverage it. And another big part here is we're seeing very few casualties from these Ukrainian strikes. They are largely against infrastructure. I mean, if you go back the last couple of months, it's rare that one of these results in anybody being killed or even wounded. And I think that helps the U.S. cause here as well. where, of course, Russia right away would say this is NATO attacking Russia, but it does take a bit of that edge off if there's no Russians killed in the actual strike, which appears to be the method that Ukraine is going, or at least that's what's been happening.
No, it's a very good point that I think is often lost, in the broader noise and hysteria of the fact that Ukraine is doing this every day, relentlessly taking 40% of Russian oil production offline. There's queues. I've got friends, colleagues in Russia. It's chaos in some parts,
yeah.
and that's just on the rural side, let alone in the cities where they try to clamp down on the information, right? But what's also interesting is the US approach to some of the shadow fleet that we've been seeing. We recently saw, I think it was France that basically just boarded a Russian dark fleet tanker. For people who aren't familiar, the shadow fleet is the basically, unadvertised ships which carry a lot of Russian natural gas or materials, commodities, whatever, around, right? China does the same. And America's been doing quite an effective job, but the Trump administration have been trying to clamp down on this. Is my understanding correct on that, or is this mainly European-led thing?
I think it's mainly European. I know or at least we've talked about it in the US, but I don't know how much action we've actually taken here in the US. I know the ship off the coast of France was allegedly being used to fly some of the drones or launch some of the drones over Denmark. The fact we didn't hear more reporting about that makes me think that is not actually where those drones came from. Because we got that initial report, they pulled the ship over, they searched it, and then it kind of fell out of the news. It's an important part here. I don't know how big of a role the United States is playing in that, though, to be honest.
Fair. The reason I'm asking is because I'm also pivoting slightly towards more of the American relationship to the maritime security of its own southern region and Venezuela. And Mr. Trump has seemingly gone to war, basically, with Maduro. And I'm very curious to know from you what you think his motives are, why he's doing this now, or is it part of a broader strategy for regime change in the country, which, well, I don't think it is, but we'll come to that.
My gut says regime change, just based off of what we're seeing and the actions played out. Just before we started recording today, there were 3 US B-52 bombers flying off the coast of Venezuela in a show force. All right.
Shit.
Wow. Yeah, right.
Wow,
so
that's not just snub. 3 B-52s. Wow. Okay. It's not like it's a couple of Raptors or something. Goodness me. Wow.
Yeah. Everything here points to more than drug interdiction. My gut says that this is a regime change, a hopeful regime change operation under the guise of counter narcotics. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to sell the population on regime change. It's a bad word. In the United States, we think of we're going to get in over our heads. We're going to get stuck in a forever war. Why do we care about Venezuela in the first place? But if you say we're going to eliminate the head of a narco trafficking drug cartel, look, most Americans are going to check that yes box when asked that question. So that's how it's been framed. But it doesn't really add up. So the majority of drugs flowing into the United States do not come from Venezuela. The biggest threat in terms of cartels and cartel capabilities does not come from Trinidad and Tobago or the Cartel of the Suns in Venezuela. They're in Mexico. So nothing that we're doing down there really, again, drugs are taking kind of a front seat in a lot of U.S. national security conversations right now. But if you were trying to clamp down on that, Venezuela would not be your first target. Trinidad and Tobago would not be your first target. So it is a little surprising to see the focus these guys are getting. We've got 4 guided missile destroyers in the Caribbean, 5 squadron, B-52s now flying over. A lot of air power, a lot of firepower down there for drugs. Just yesterday, we saw what I believe is the 5th drone strike, or probably a drone strike against a cartel boat. And it looks like we're kind of setting the stage. I think it was 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration said we are now in an armed conflict with the cartels. And that on its own doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but it sets the stage for continued military strikes, because a lot of the legal pushback was this is clearly not in self-defense, and you cannot engage these foreign terrorist organizations in a lethal manner unless you're in an armed conflict with them. Well, Trump said we are now in an armed conflict. Seems like that really opens the door to an increase in military operations.
But why not just own it at this point? What I find interesting from my coverage of Venezuela and Latin America, from more of the diplomatic or whatever geopolitical side, it seems to be that the people who are anti any kind of should we say, intervention is more of the left-leaning part of the political spectrum, the progressives, the anti-war voices, right? If you actually speak to Venezuelans on the ground, of which I have many, they want some kind of direct. They can't wait for America or a coalition or whatever it is to come in to overthrow Maduro. Frankly, I would love to see him gone. There's nothing I want more than Conchada to become the leader or some kind of alternative, right? Because there's so much that Venezuela can give the world, a stabilizing force, energy markets, and so on. So why do you think that is?
Something seems personal to me with Maduro. I don't know exactly where that is coming from within the administration, but it seems like the focus is getting rid of him. And to your point, there are plenty. Look, Maduro's a bum, right? Saying the elections were tampered with is like a complete understatement. He lost the elections by all accounts. He's not a good person. And I agree that it would generally be better, not just for the Venezuelans, but for the world, if he was no longer in power. Of course, that raises the question of what comes after Maduro, which is kind of the issue with regime change. But something about it just seems personal to me, because nothing has drastically changed in U.S.-Venezuelan relationship in the last 6 to 9 months. Trinidad did not become all of a sudden more capable in the last 9 months. It seems like we just decided time is up. We're going after this. And it's Maduro. So like there were leaked discussions that came out about how Maduro offered up interest in Venezuelan oil companies and how he cut ties or was going to cut ties with Iran, China, and Russia. So all of these other arguments as to why Venezuela might need to be, quote, dealt with seem to have been somewhat resolved in negotiations, with the exception of Maduro actually leaving. And when you look at the language of how the U.S. is framing this, it's all focused on him. We've got a bounty on Maduro. That tells you put bounties on criminals, right? He's a criminal. We're going to go arrest this criminal terrorist. I don't know why now all of a sudden Maduro is public enemy number one. Again, he's a bad dude. He's no friend of the United States. But the best I can come up with is there's something personal there, someone within the administration that is really pushing this, because it is a little bit unprompted, I would say, in terms of the timing.
It is. No, as I say, I spent a lot of time working in the US at the time during the first attempt to sort of oust Maduro in 2018, when that election was obviously falsified. And that was the driver of a huge array of Venezuelan migration north through Central America to the southern border. And obviously there is I think a desire by Trump. He seems personally vendetted also about the fentanyl crisis, even though I don't think there's much linkage between the fentanyl crisis and Venezuela. Yeah. So there seems to be quite a few different motivations there. But what I am interested in from the military side is, are taking out these cartel vessels a sort of a prerequisite necessary to then launch a larger scale campaign or something? Why focus on these cartel vessels? What does that achieve? Why not just go whole hog if you're going to do it? You know what I mean?
I think everything we've seen so far is attempting pressure to get Maduro to leave power. We saw it was a U.S. Brian Mast, maybe, U.S. representative. They asked him about regime change, and he said it'd be great if Maduro just happened to not be in power anymore. So I think we did take the approach of a very soft regime change. If we just push in the right spots, maybe someone will rise up or Maduro will flee, and that didn't happen. But I think that was the attempt. And, again, when you're looking at the framing of this, if the collateral damage is a boat full of traffickers and drugs, allegedly, people aren't going to lose a lot of sleep over that. So I think the administration found a route to kind of push, and they've done that a couple times. The next logical step to me would be long-range strikes against cartel facilities in Venezuela. We've got 4 guided missile destroyers in the Caribbean carrying Tomahawks, and we don't need F-35s to get into Venezuelan airspace, but those would be a lot safer for our pilots to utilize in going after cartel facilities in Venezuela. That seems like the next step up. It's hard to imagine that we would go directly after the Venezuelan military, although there are ties between their military, especially at the higher levels, and some of these cartels. But that also seems like it might be there before too long.
But this is the thing. What makes me concerned or wary is what happened, obviously, in Panama in 1989, right? And even though that was 6 weeks, a 2-month campaign, it was still very messy and not a good look for H.W. Bush at the time. But from one analysis piece I read, it said that there was enough military buildup by the US now for sufficient, quote, seizure operation. Would you agree with that?
I don't think so. I think we're still a little bit light, but this is what's so frustrating, man, because like if that's what we're trying to do, like let's have that conversation, right? And are we on board with going into Venezuela with boots on the ground or not? I feel like we're not having that conversation though, because everything is framed with stopping the flow of drugs into the United States, so it's just hitting cartel boats. But like you're saying, and I'm sure your audience has seen this steady escalation looks like more than stopping cartel boats. So it feels like we're debating series of facts A, not you and I, but kind of the general public and the news media, where the entire thing is happening over here. It's B, C, D, and E. Like, so that's what makes me concerned is it's going to feel like we stumbled into this accidentally when a part of me thinks this might be the plan the whole time. It's just not out there for conversation, not out there for discussion. You would not find, for all of the wonderful people in Venezuela that want the Americans to come in or anybody to come in and remove Maduro, man, I can't. If you poll the American people, my gut is 10% or less said they'd be open to direct military intervention in Venezuela. That just hasn't been sold as to why we need to be down there doing that.
What about but also, can I just say, I'm not laughing, audience, as sort of as though this is a funny subject. It's more just, I can tell how impassioned Preston is because he's like, okay, like this at the camera, and it's like he's it's just you're really into it. But I guess my second to last question for you is basically just then, what about a more limited campaign, maritime focused, right? But that's not going to be enough to overslow the government. Yeah, what if they're launching strikes from the coastline? Is this going to have to involve some kind of ground offensive operation?
It gets back to what are we doing down there? It doesn't do anything. So if we shut off all drugs coming from Venezuela, I'm not sure it even makes a dent in the drugs entering the United States. So if we're successful in that campaign, we put all of these resources, all these military resources, reallocated them from around the world to the Caribbean for what? Like that's just not the flow of fentanyl. It's not the heavy flow of drugs. It's something. And yeah, stopping something is better than nothing, but that's a lot of resources for not really having a major impact on what makes it to the United States. So I don't think it can. I don't think it can stop the way that it's being framed today. It can't stop with just drone strikes on boats because that's not actually doing anything.
And I guess the last question I have for you on this before we wrap up this fantastic conversation, Preston, was simply then, what would you recommend them to do if you're in that room, if you're in that position, right? Because there are some people who argue that this is also about oil control, supply security, national security, because of Venezuelans' provocations over Essequibo, which is a territory in Guyana just east of the country. There was a big military build-up there about 18 months ago, almost 2 years ago now. Everyone was like, oh, holy shit, this is going to be a new hotspot. Never materialized. But, how much do you think that plays into it? And what would you recommend, or what would you like to see?
I'd like to see, and maybe my memory is warped now because it's been a while, but if I recall correctly, going into Iraq in 2003, there were clear guidelines listed by George W. Bush saying these are the things that need to happen inside 72 hours or else, similar to the Gulf War. These are our stipulations or else it will be met with military force. I'd like to see that. A couple of days ago, it was announced that the U.S. is walking away from diplomatic solutions here. And I was like, what diplomatic solutions? What are we even trying to get out of this? It wasn't even clear that was ongoing. So I would push for that and say, whatever the desired end state is here, let's just make that argument to the American people. Because without that, to your point, there's all these questions about, is it oil? Is it regime change? Is it drugs? Is it Russia? Is it their ties to Iran? Is it China? We don't know. And I don't think that's helpful because, again, we don't know what the desired end state is if it's all of these different things kind of creeping in. So my push to the administration, if I was sitting in there, is just make the case. Make the argument.
Yeah. No, I've been doing a lot of historical reading on the Gulf War and also fascinatingly just what happened in the Iran-Iraq War and America's in the build-up to that. But sorry, bonus question I have to ask you, that what does this do for Trump's reputation? What does it do for the political-military relationship, given that he's trying to leverage the National Guard as some kind of, law enforcement, right? This is, if he goes against everything he said about being peace president, which to be fair, he's, made progress in ways Biden didn't, isn't that a massive risk for him? Or he doesn't care about that?
No, I think it depends how it goes. So attacking Iran was a major risk, I would say, leading up to it. But now it is entirely a political win. And you're seeing Trump and his administration hammer that home any chance they get. I don't think there's very many people that say president of peace and genuinely believe that we're all that different. We're carrying out strikes in Syria and Iraq. We're still drone striking people around the world. Kicked off a pretty significant campaign against the Houthis. I don't think there's a lot of people that say president of peace and genuinely mean that. So I think a lot of it comes down to, would it be effective, and would there be any American lives lost? I think if we carry out some kind of campaign like we are right now, it can continue to be presented as strength in the Caribbean. The minute an American dies during this fight, I think it could turn the tables quite a bit.
Fair play. And I think he does have a good habit of picking collectively unsavory groups. Like the Houthis are largely not popular.
Who's going to back him, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Maduro's not exactly popular, but I don't see China or Russia really getting that involved. But anyway, thank you so much, Preston. Thank you, everyone, for watching. If you enjoyed it, then do check out part 1 if you missed it, and do check out, of course, not that I need to say that, but Preston's incredible coverage and somehow churning out so many amazing videos a day. But we'll see you all very soon. Take care.